Think modern toilets are bad. Try pooping off a castle wall or during a windstorm with no toilet paper. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where every bathroom break was a gamble with dignity, disease, and gravity. You're not ready for this. Think your life is hard. Try being a medieval peasant with no pants, no underwear, and a bathroom that doubled as a death trap. The Middle Ages weren't exactly known for their comfort or common sense. You're out in the fields all day, your tunic barely covers your rear, and when nature calls, it doesn't wait for modesty. Pants weren't even a universal concept. Some people just tied a belt around their tunic and hoped their dignity didn't fall out with gravity. Underwear was optional, and not in the sexy French kind of way, more like I hope this sackcloth doesn't chafe me into madness. And that's before we get to where they actually did their business. Picture this. It's 1347. You've just eaten a suspicious stew of barley onion and something that might have once been a pigeon. Your gut starts a low rumble, ominous biblical even. Do you run to a toilet? Nope. You squat somewhere behind the barn, stare into the cold, judgmental eyes of a chicken and pray the wind doesn't turn. There's no privacy. Just you, your regrets, and a clump of grass that's seen too much. Now, if you were slightly wealthier, say you worked for the manor or were lucky enough to be a town merchant, you might have access to something called a chamber pot. Don't let the word pot fool you. This was not a cute ceramic bowl with floral patterns. It was a glorified bucket living under your bed, waiting like a silent monster to be filled with last night's sins. And no, there was no lid. Why? Because even the concept of containment was too advanced for the Middle Ages. But let's back up. How did we even get here? Why did an entire continent decide collectively that pants and sanitation were optional? Blame a weird mix of religious guilt, poor engineering, and a fear of witches. The church wasn't big on nakedness. Baths were suspect, especially public ones, which often became sexy social mixers. So instead of scrubbing away germs, people layered on more fabric and hoped the stench of sin would keep Satan at bay. It didn't. It just created Satan's own locker room. Let's not forget this was also a time when people believed your mood was controlled by bodily fluids called humors. So if you were grumpy, constipated, or visibly leaking pus, it wasn't a hygiene issue, it was a cosmic imbalance. Doctors back then, if we can call them, that might prescribe leeches, trepanning, or even more prayer as a remedy. Meanwhile, you're slowly rotting from the inside out, dreaming of a future where toilet paper exists. Good luck. The irony. They built cathedrals that scraped the heavens but couldn't figure out where to poop without ruining someone's crops. They had stained glass flying buttresses and Latin sermons, but no sewer systems that worked. The result? Streets filled with the animal dung, human waste, and the occasional dead rat, basically a soup of sadness. Imagine stepping out for a walk and slipping on something that used to be a person's lunch. That was Monday. So next time you walk into a restroom with a flushing toilet, running water, and scented soap, take a moment. Whisper a quiet thank you to progress. And maybe apologise to your ancestors who had to drop their shame into a hole in the ground while avoiding wolves. Because in medieval times, even going to the bathroom was a brush with death and not the dignified kind. No pants, no problem. Tell that to the guy who sneezed while squatting and never stood up again. Let's say you were lucky enough to avoid pooping in the bushes or behind a barn. Congratulations, peasant, you've graduated to the glamorous world of the chamber pot. Now, before your brain pictures something elegant or even vaguely ceramic, allow me to crush your dreams with the smell of centuries-old urine. Chamber pots were the great equalizer of medieval life, rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone had one and they all sucked. You kept them under the bed like a dirty secret ready to be used in the dead of night because walking outside meant risking wolves, thieves, or falling into your own waste pit. Yes, your bedroom had a built-in poop grenade. The thing about chamber pots is nobody wanted to deal with them. Sure, they were convenient, but what happens in the pot doesn't stay in the pot. Someone had to dump it, and that someone was usually the youngest, the poorest, or the most recently married. That's the lottery part. Every household had its own system of punishment disguised as duty. Some unlucky soul would march through the streets at dawn with a brimming pot of shame, praying the wind didn't shift or that their shoes had enough grip. One wrong move and you're wearing last night's dinner twice. The dumping options weren't any better. Ideally, you'd toss it into a designated cesspit. Realistically, you aimed for the gutter outside and hoped gravity and rain would finish the job. Entire towns reeked of ammonia and despair, especially in summer when heat turned streets into open-air urinals. People would shout "Gardiloo," a delightful little warning meaning "Duck, here comes the contents of my digestive system." Imagine walking to market and getting baptised in someone else's chamber pot blessings. Sanitation was less a system and more of a collective shrug. In castles things got fancy, and by fancy I mean marginally less disgusting. Servants would handle your pot for you, which is like saying you're too important to carry your own body fluids. The pot would be emptied into a chute, sometimes leading to the moat. Yes, the same moat people admired for defence and occasionally fished in. Think about that next time you imagine medieval romance by the castle walls. Nothing says chivalry like the stench of fermented duke droppings wafting over the parapets. And then there were the innkeepers, those brave souls who had to manage the biological carnage of travellers. Most inns didn't have latrines, just a stack of pots and an attitude of try not to spill. Imagine staying in a room above 10 others, all using the same floor for relief. If the smell didn't get you, the sound did. You didn't sleep in a medieval inn, you survived it. And the chamber pot wasn't your friend. It was a ticking, steaming betrayal. So yes, the chamber pot was revolutionary if your standard for revolution includes daily trauma and ankle-deep regret. But hey, it was better than nothing, just barely. Because in the end, every chamber pot came with 2 guarantees: no dignity and a 40% chance of ruining your socks. And that, dear listener, is why medieval people didn't just fear the devil, they feared Tuesday mornings with a full pot and no one else home. Let's get one thing straight: if you had access to a permanent hole in the ground, congrats, you were living the medieval dream. A pit latrine, basic as it sounds, was a step up from chamber pots and behind the barn squats. Think about it, a designated place to dump your dignity away from where you sleep, cook, or, God forbid, eat. That was luxury. It meant you or someone in your community had dug a hole, covered it, maybe even put a little wooden seat over it. In a world where most people couldn't spell hygiene, this was peak innovation. But like all things in the Middle Ages, there was a catch many actually. First, you had to maintain it, which meant occasionally digging a new one because the old one was full. And by full, I mean seeping with misery full, to the point where flies filed complaints. Second, there was the smell. A pit latrine in summer was like opening a doorway to hell's sweaty armpit. Third, location mattered too far and no one used it. Too close, and you were basically sleeping beside a bubbling cauldron of disease. If you lived in a city, you might have been lucky enough to have a privy yard, an alley or corner that everyone shared. Translation: a community hole filled with other people's secrets. No privacy, no toilet paper, and God help you if you drop something important down there. Archaeologists love these places. Now they dig up medieval latrines and find coins, combs, even jewellery. But let's be real, those weren't accidents. That was medieval karma. Drop your silver ring into a poop pit. That's the universe telling you to stop showing off. And don't go thinking nobles had it better. Sure, they had privies built into their homes, little stone cubicles with wooden seats over vertical shafts, but they didn't exactly scream comfort. They were cold, dark and echoey like pooping inside a haunted mailbox. No ventilation, no cleaning crew, just centuries of noble waste sliding down into a cesspit below. Sometimes that cesspit was right beneath the castle, because nothing says luxury like dining above a historical landfill. Royal life glamorous in stories, gag-worthy in practice. There was also the minor issue of what happens when the pit gets full. Spoiler alert, nothing good. Towns often forgot or ignored the need to clean them out, so the pits just overflowed. Into streets, alleys, sometimes people's basements. Ever wondered why plague spread so fast? Imagine your neighbour's bathroom bubbling up under your floorboards. You wouldn't need rats. The smell alone could finish you off. So yes, the humble hole in the ground was a step up in medieval sanitation, but it came with a list of side effects longer than a 14th century sermon. If you had one, you were lucky. If you had one that didn't explode overflow or give you tetanus, you were basically royalty. And if you had one that smelled, well, you didn't. Stop dreaming. Let's talk about castles, the ultimate symbol of medieval power, wealth, and poop. Behind those towering stone walls and majestic tapestries was an ecosystem of stenches that could gag a goat. You think castles were all grand halls and romantic candlelight? Try walking through one during a heatwave. The walls trapped heat, the people trapped gas, and the toilets. Well, they weren't really toilets. They were vertical crimes against humanity called garderobes. Now the word garderobe sounds classy, French, elegant. Don't be fooled. It was basically a closet with a hole cut into a wooden seat perched over an open shaft, or worse, the outside wall. That's right. Your royal waste just plummeted into the moat below, or onto the hillside, or onto a very unlucky passer-by. And in winter, it froze like brown medieval icicles. In summer, it steamed. Like the devil's own sauna right underneath your bedroom. To make things worse, these garderobes were built into castle walls which acted like giant thermoses for fecal vapour. The smell had nowhere to go but back into your room, especially if the wind changed. Some people kept herbs or flowers near the opening to mask the stench, because nothing says romance like dried lavender next to the abyss. Others believed the smell kept away evil spirits. That's not superstition. That's desperation wrapped in incense and denial. And let's not forget the maintenance, or the total lack of it. No one cleaned the shafts. Waste built up like geological layers of regret. Occasionally the castle would hire a few brave souls to shovel it out, but that was rare and usually came after an outbreak of plague or rebellion. Until then the residents just lived with it, sat beside it, slept above it, made love next to it. Medieval love songs were probably just cries of "hold your breath." Even royalty wasn't spared. King Henry VIII had a groom of the stool, a real job, mind you, whose duty was to wipe the king's royal backside and record his bowel habits. Imagine getting knighted for your loyalty and your ability to manage poop with discretion. And while some castles had multi-seat garderobes, they weren't for socialising. They were for efficiency. Nothing bonds a family like simultaneous defecation while a bard sings in the next room. So yes, castles were impressive, but they were also giant fortified outhouses with chandeliers. When you see a romantic painting of medieval life, remember somewhere just outside the frame someone was dangling their behind into the abyss, praying the wind didn't turn. And someone below was looking up, thinking, please not again. Castles didn't just defend people, they imprisoned smells. And in the Middle Ages, that was the real siege. Let's take a leisurely stroll across a medieval bridge, shall we? Take in the fresh air, admire the view. Oh, wait, what's that falling from above? Surprise. It's human waste, courtesy of the charming public latrines built directly into the bridge walls. That's right, some medieval towns decided to combine architecture and bowel movements in the most efficient and horrifying way possible. Why walk to a toilet when you can just hang your butt over the river? These toilet bridges weren't rare flukes, they were civic planning at its finest. London Bridge, for example, had dozens of buildings crammed onto it, including shops, homes, and yes, latrines. The idea was that the river would conveniently wash everything away. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The Thames just collected centuries of human effluence and fermented it into a soup of medieval despair. Historians like to romanticize the bustling commerce of the bridge. They forget to mention the airborne poop. Crossing a bridge back then wasn't just about getting from point A to B. It was a high-stakes game of spatial awareness and emotional numbness. People would shout warnings or sometimes just wouldn't. You could be deep in conversation and suddenly find yourself wearing someone's lunch. And heaven help you if you slipped near the edge one misstep, and you'd take a plunge straight into a floating buffet of sewage fish guts and bits of yesterday's plague victim. Medieval rivers weren't just water, they were historical trauma in liquid form. And guess what? These bridge toilets weren't just for commoners. Monks used them. Nobles used them. Even town officials gave their sacred behinds to the current of divine filth. The logic was the same, the river's there, why not use it? It's easy, it's fast, and it's someone else's problem downstream. The people in charge knew full well this wasn't sanitary, but they also didn't care. Sanitation didn't exist as a concept, just as an afterthought, when people started dying en masse. The real kicker, some cities actually taxed people for dumping waste into rivers. Yes, they monetized their own downfall. Want to ruin the ecosystem? That'll be 2p thanks. It's like charging people to set fire to the hospital. And the worst part, people paid. Because if there's one thing consistent across history, it's the human willingness to pay for convenience no matter how horrifying the outcome. So next time you walk across a charming old bridge in Europe, take a moment. Imagine the centuries of screams, slips and splashes, the commerce, the cathedrals, the crap. Bridges weren't just landmarks. They were medieval drive-through bathrooms with no windows and no mercy. Look up, trust no overhang, and walk quickly. If you've ever used a porta-potty and thought, wow, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, let me introduce you to the medieval garderobe. Sounds fancy, right? It's French. It means to guard one's robes. Which is ironic, because nothing guarded your robes less than dangling your exposed behind over a stone hole 50 feet above a cesspit. It was less of a toilet and more of a medieval trust fall, except you were falling into darkness, and what you trusted was your aim and the structural integrity of ancient masonry. Garderobes were built into castle walls like poop sniper towers. The idea was gravity would handle the problem, which is a poetic way of saying, let's make feces someone else's problem as fast as possible. These vertical shafts dropped waste into pits moats, or if the architect was especially sadistic, straight onto a hillside where someone might be walking. You think having a bathroom above ground level is normal? Imagine it with no plumbing, no privacy, and a breeze that occasionally reversed. The phrase "wind chill" had an entirely different meaning when your bare bottom was getting slapped by the air gods. But the real danger wasn't just the fall of waste, it was the fall into it. Every few years some poor soul would lean too far, slip on a mossy step, or get startled mid-squat and boom right into the filth pit. Imagine your last moment on Earth being lost to the poop void beneath Lord Percival's South Tower. It happened. There are actual historical records of people drowning in cesspits. Imagine being the monk who had to write that in the Abbey logbook, Brother Geoffrey, aged 37. Devout. Slipped mid-wipe. May he rest far from our noses. And remember, garderobes were cold. Freezing cold. You had to disrobe your layers, sometimes 5 or 6 garments, just to use them, which turned every trip into an exposure therapy session. Your butt went numb before your dignity did. People use straw or moss to wipe, which sounds charming, until you realise straw in winter is the medieval version of a cheese grater dipped in ice, and heaven forbid you dropped anything down the shaft. There were no retrieval tools, no lost and found, just the sound of your family heirloom clunking into a pit of ancestral stew. Some castles got fancy and installed multi-seat garderobes thinking this was the future of sanitation. But there's something deeply cursed about communal pooping holes carved into stone. The acoustics alone could trigger existential crises. You'd sit in awkward silence, praying the person next to you wasn't planning a conversation, or worse, a confession. No partitions, no dignity. Just eye contact and shared regret echoing through the corridors of power. So yes, beware the garderobe drop. Not just the literal fall, but the psychological descent into medieval toilet horror. It wasn't just a place to relieve yourself, it was a roulette wheel of humiliation, injury, and possibly death. Sit carefully, clench bravely. And if the wind howls through the stone shaft, whisper a prayer to St. Fluscius. He won't help, but at least you'll go down believing in something. Let's talk about medieval toilet paper. Spoiler alert, there wasn't any. What there was, however, was an astonishing level of improvisation that makes modern camping look like spa day. People wiped with straw moss hay rags, their hand snow leaves, or whatever unlucky object was within arm's reach. If it was softish and didn't bite, it qualified. In the absence of Charmin, they embraced what historians now refer to as the grab and hope method. Straw was a fan favourite, plentiful, absorbent, and always a little too sharp for comfort. If you've never wiped yourself with the medieval equivalent of a broom count your blessings, moss was considered high-end green soft, even a little soothing if you ignored the insects. But only those living near forests had access. For city folks, the options were grimmer old cloth scraps, broken pottery, yes pottery, or reused wool. That's right, reused, meaning someone else used it before you. Sanitation was not just optional, it was fictional. But the real champions of this unhygienic Olympics were the Romans, and guess what medieval folk sometimes inherited from them? The tussorium, a sponge on a stick shared by everyone in the latrine. Picture a communal poop Q-tip soaking in a bucket of salt water between uses. The theory was rinse, swipe, repeat. The reality was diseases had a conga line. The Middle Ages took this idea, squinted at it and said, let's make it worse. Most people didn't even rinse anything. They just wiped and walked away like hygiene was a myth spread by witches. And then there's the hand. Yes, that hand. In many parts of the medieval world, people simply used their left hand to do the dirty work. Why the left? Because the right hand was for God and bread, and the left was for sins, bodily and otherwise. This created an entire social etiquette around which hand to shake and which hand to hide. If someone in a tavern offered you their left hand, you either fought them or moved to a different continent. Bathing was supposed to help, but bathing wasn't exactly popular or frequent. Most peasants bathed monthly as best, and nobles didn't want to be seen naked, because modesty was more important than microbial warfare. So if you think wiping with hay and never washing is a hygiene crime, you're right. They didn't just compete in the hygiene Olympics, they created the event, broke every rule, and awarded themselves gold medals made of plague. So the next time you sit on your porcelain throne reaching for 3-ply tissue, engineered by space scientists, think about your ancestors. Think about the straw, the snow, the sponge on a stick passed around like a cursed baton. Think about the left hand, then light a candle. Whisper thanks to modern plumbing. And never complain about running out of toilet paper again unless you're prepared to use bark. Imagine walking into a crowded wooden building filled with naked strangers, steam thick enough to choke a goat, and water that hasn't been changed since the Crusades. Congratulations, you're in a medieval public bathhouse. These places were the social hubs of their time where people went to wash away their sins, diseases, and last week's stew, preferably all at once. Men and women often bathed together, which sounds scandalous until you realise everyone smelled like wet wool and fermented onions. The goal wasn't so much cleanliness as it was less filthiness, and the bar was underground. Now, to be fair, the idea of communal bathing wasn't always disgusting. It started off with good intentions. Influenced by Roman traditions, bathhouses were seen as a way to keep the body and soul in check. But by the time the Middle Ages got hold of the concept, things had deteriorated. Think less spa retreat and more fever dream with soap. Some bathhouses even had snack vendors inside. You could literally eat roasted chestnuts while sitting in a tub of lukewarm foot broth. Bon appetit. And did I mention they didn't change the water between guests? Because they didn't. That was considered wasteful. So what you were bathing in wasn't just your filth, it was everyone's filth congealing in real time. It was a soup of shame. The rich got private tubs, but the poor shared everything from towels to fungi. You know how gyms today have signs that say please shower before entering the pool? In medieval bathhouses that would have been a laugh track. Nobody showered after, let alone before. Eventually the church caught wind of all this skin-on-skin nonsense and decided bathhouses were the devil's playground, which, to be fair, they kind of were. Many bathhouses doubled as brothels, turning the phrase steamy encounter into a health code violation. So the church shut many of them down, not because of the germs, but because people were having fun. Sinful, soapy fun, which meant more people stayed dirty and more diseases got comfy. Cleanliness might be next to godliness, but filth was next to the tavern. By the 15th century, bathing had gone out of fashion entirely in some places. People believed water opened the pores and let the plague in. So instead of washing, they layered more clothes, more perfume, more denial. Queen Isabella of Castile famously claimed she bathed twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding. That's not hygiene. That's slow-cooked monarchy. And yet somehow public bathhouses still lingered in certain towns, like an awkward medieval uncle, too smelly to ignore, too broke to upgrade. So yes, medieval bathhouses were less about hygiene and more about community filth management. If you walked out with fewer lice than you entered with, it was considered a win. If you didn't catch syphilis, even better. And if you found love in a lukewarm wooden tub surrounded by coughing strangers, congratulations, you just survived the grossest Tinder date in history. Swipe left, scrub harder. Let's talk about urine, yes, pee. The golden stream that in the Middle Ages wasn't just waste, it was currency. Liquid gold, literally. Medieval people found so many uses for urine that you'd think it was endorsed by royal decree. If you peed, you profited, assuming you were bold enough to collect and sell it. Welcome to the urine economy, where your bladder was basically a side hustle. Urine, or chamber lye as they so poetically called it, was prized for its ammonia content. This made it ideal for cleaning because nothing screams sanitation like scrubbing your laundry with old pee. Tanners used it to soften animal hides, dyers used it to set colours in fabric, and fullers, people whose job was to clean wool, literally stomped barefoot in barrels of urine-soaked cloth all day long. That wasn't a metaphor. That was Tuesday. Cities even had pee collectors who'd go door to door asking for your household's finest urine. Think of them as medieval milkmen, but in reverse and smellier. Some towns had communal pots in public corners just for this purpose. Passers-by were encouraged to contribute. Imagine needing to pee and thinking, ah yes, let me add this to the community bucket, so someone can turn a profit. That's not a public restroom. That's capitalism with bladder pressure. And the best part, it was taxed. Of course it was. Governments found a way to monetize even urine. In ancient Rome, which medieval Europe inherited many practices from Emperor Vespasian taxed public urinals. When his son criticised it, Vespasian allegedly held up a coin and asked, "Does it smell?" Hence the phrase "pecunia non olet money doesn't stink." Spoiler, it absolutely did. Medieval folks didn't just use urine for laundry and leather. They also thought it could cure diseases. Toothache gargle with pee. Acne rub some on your face. Bad spirits. Sprinkle it on your doorway like holy water's shady cousin. It was the Windex of the Middle Ages. If you could pee on it, it could probably be fixed. Or ruined. Results varied. Strongly. So the next time you flush without a second thought, remember people used to hoard that stuff. They sold it, scrubbed with it, dyed with it, even bathed in it. The medieval world didn't waste a single drop. Not out of enlightenment, but out of sheer unapologetic desperation. They turned urine into an economic asset, and in doing so gave liquid asset a whole new meaning. Now that's what I call streaming revenue. Imagine trying to poop while obeying a vow of silence. Welcome to monastic bathroom life, where bodily functions were sacred, scheduled, and strictly unspoken. Monks lived in communities where rules governed everything. Prayer times, meals, speech, even how and when to relieve themselves. The rule of St. Benedict, followed by many medieval monasteries, didn't outline bathroom etiquette in great detail, but don't worry, the monks filled in the gaps with awkward devotion and a whole lot of bowel discipline. Silence wasn't just a virtue, it was an obligation, even while nature roared. To avoid chatter in the cloistered commode, monks developed a kind of butt-based choreography. They would line up in quiet solidarity robes, swishing like holy ghosts, and enter a long stone building over a flowing stream, essentially a group latrine with no partitions. Everyone sat in a row, no eye contact, no whispering, just the soft echo of shifting habits and gastrointestinal repentance. It was like synchronized swimming, but with shame and constipation. These places were called ruridatas from the Latin behind the dormitory. They were large shared latrines built above drainage channels. Monks would file in at assigned times, usually before or after prayers, and conduct their business with solemn focus. Talkers were punished. Laughers were excommunicated. Okay, maybe not, but you'd definitely be cleaning privies for a month. And yet, despite all this order, the smell was legendary. No vow of silence could suppress the olfactory violence of 100 vegetarian monks with digestive issues. Monastic plumbing wasn't half bad, though. Some abbeys had surprisingly advanced drainage systems with running water to carry waste away, far more civilized than what many peasants had. Cistercian monasteries in particular were known for their engineering. They even had flushing mechanisms using diverted river water. Yes, while nobles were pooping into moats, monks had primitive bidets. But you couldn't talk about it. Ever. You could write entire theological treatises, but saying "pass the moss" out loud was apparently where they drew the line. And of course, penance sometimes included bathroom-related humiliation. A monk who broke silence or committed a minor sin might be assigned the latrine rota cleaning the reredorta with a wooden shovel and enough holy regret to fill a psalter. One chronicler wrote about a monk who, upon finding a beetle in the privy, wept for an hour, believing it was a sign of his moral decay. Was it? Probably not. But when your life is 90% silence and 10% fear of eternal damnation, every bug feels like judgment. So yes, monks went to the bathroom, just like everyone else. They just did it in rows without a word, while possibly making eye contact with a fresco of St. Augustine, which might be the most spiritually confusing way to poop in history. And if you think that's bad, wait until you hear how peasants did it with 0 rules, 0 plumbing, and 0 divine supervision. Let's paint a picture. You're a medieval peasant, it's dawn, your hut is made of sticks and questionable hope, and your bowels are staging a mutiny. What do? There's no chamber pot, no garderobe, no monastic stone row with flowing water. There's just the wide, glorious outdoors, and an urgent need to not soil your one good tunic. Thus begins the daily ritual known to historians, and probably no one else, as the peasant poop dance, a frantic shuffle between shame and desperation, and whatever patch of earth won't curse your descendants. Unlike nobles or monks, peasants didn't have assigned toilets. Their latrine was wherever their legs gave out behind the haystack near the pig pen, or halfway through harvesting wheat. Privacy. That was a myth like clean water or fair wages. You learned to squat, fast wipe faster, and pretend your neighbour wasn't making eye contact from the other side of the fence. And if it was winter, good luck. Your butt froze to the earth before your soul had time to process the trauma. But there was a system, if you could call it that. Some villages had communal dung heaps or shared fields unofficially designated as that spot. You went there, did your business, and prayed the wind didn't carry the shame back to your front door. Unfortunately, many peasants just went wherever they felt safest near their homes, near the animals, sometimes even near the well. Yes, the same well they drank from. And people wonder how diseases like dysentery and cholera became national traditions. Peasants were also deeply superstitious. Many believed that spirits haunted places of waste or that devils entered through the bowels. Some carried talismans while pooping. Others whispered protective prayers mid-squat because nothing says spiritual multitasking like asking Saint Anthony to protect your soul while you soil the earth. And if your cow died or your crops failed, you might very well blame where you last took a dump. Medieval life wasn't just hard. It was spiritually exhausting. Even your bowel movements required divine negotiation. Children. Oh, they were feral. Most of them didn't even know the concept of toilet existed. They went wherever their tiny legs took them. Ditches, doorways, church steps. Some peasants treated manure as part of the natural cycle of life. And to be fair, they weren't wrong. Human waste was often used as fertilizer because when your entire economy is based on mud and luck, you make do. But still, walking barefoot through fields fertilized by your cousin's breakfast is a uniquely medieval bonding experience. So no peasants didn't have bathrooms. They had strategies. A mental map of bushes, fences, and quiet spots that changed with the season's wind direction and neighbourly gossip. It wasn't just about survival. It was a daily gamble against exposure shame and gastrointestinal betrayal. The peasant poop dance was real. It was raw. And it had no winners, just survivors with stained boots and dead stares. Let's take a moment to honour the medieval world's most underappreciated and overexposed workforce, the night soil men. If you've never heard of them, that's because history tries really hard to forget the people who shoveled poop for a living. But they were real. They existed. And they were the only thing standing between medieval cities and complete olfactory collapse. These men were the midnight janitors of society's collective bowels, the unsung sanitation squad, with shovels, buckets, and trauma. Night soil men worked under the cover of darkness, partly because it was cooler, partly because no one wanted to see what they were doing while eating breakfast. They would haul human waste from cesspits, latrines, chamber pots, and anywhere else. The noble art of defecation had been practiced. Their tools were basic buckets, long-handled scoops, and nerves of steel. Imagine climbing into a wooden cart piled high, with liquefied regret navigating cobblestone streets in the dark, praying you didn't hit a bump. Every trip was a health hazard wrapped in humiliation garnished with the scent of humanity's worst decisions. The job was deadly. Cesspits weren't just smelly, they were toxic. The build-up of methane and hydrogen sulfide gas could knock you out cold. Some night soil men suffocated while working, falling into pits that swallowed them like stinky sinkholes. Others slipped, fell in, and, well, let's just say they didn't come back with the bucket. One wrong move and you were history's least glamorous martyr. Here lies Reginald, who drowned in Sir Godfrey's fifth-floor sins. Not exactly the kind of eulogy you want on your gravestone, and yet cities needed them. Without night soil, men waste would pile up spread disease and turn already filthy streets into rivers of ruin. These men kept medieval civilization from literally choking on its own crap. They knew the underbelly of every city, every pit and trench, every noble who pooped too much cabbage and not enough humility. They were invisible heroes until they weren't. If you saw one in the daylight, you'd hold your breath, cross the street and pretend to examine a very interesting wall. Social hierarchy was strict, and at the bottom stood the man holding the bucket. They were paid poorly. They were despised publicly. But behind closed doors, everyone was grateful. Imagine how bad things had to get before a medieval noble whispered, "Fetch the soil men." It was like hiring the Ghostbusters, but with more buckets and fewer jokes. Some even passed the job down through families turning feces into a generational enterprise. That's not a dynasty. That's a brown legacy carved into the walls of every alley they disinfected. So next time you flush a toilet and walk away like it's nothing, remember the night soil men. Remember the buckets, the stench, the silent march through streets that hated them but couldn't live without them. They didn't wear capes. They wore stains. And they deserve more than a footnote. They deserve a statue, preferably somewhere downwind. Let's talk about one of the great unspoken tragedies of medieval womanhood going to the bathroom in a full-body fabric prison. Forget corsets. Medieval women wore layers, and layers, and layers. Underdresses, overdresses, bodices, petticoats, woolen shifts, aprons, veils, and occasionally what can only be described as textile punishment. Now picture needing to pee after 2 hours of hauling water, chasing geese, and survive it on turnip stew. Congratulations, you're about to face the logistical nightmare that was medieval urination with dignity. First you had to find somewhere private, which meant not visible to everyone in the village, a rare condition in a world where doors were optional. Then came the undressing. But here's the trick: you didn't actually remove everything. You hiked it up, like a one-woman circus act, balancing bundles of cloth in one hand while squatting over mud with the grace of a collapsing tent. The threat of tripping on your own underthings while half-squatting was very real. And if it was winter, frozen skirts, frozen behind frozen sole, some women cut slits in their undergarments for easier access. Sounds clever, right? It was. It was also drafty. And in a society where just showing your ankles made you a sinner, any clothing with built-in access points carried a risk of moral scandal. So women got creative. Some wore no undergarments at all, which frankly was less about seduction and more about survival. If you've ever tried to squat in 15 pounds of wet wool, you know that modesty ends where bladder pressure begins. And then there was pregnancy. Try squatting in a field with a baby belly while holding up 6 skirts and hoping you don't give birth mid-pee. Medieval midwives were tough, but even they didn't want to deliver babies near compost heaps. There are records of women giving birth in barns, gardens, and yes, even near communal latrines. Because when plumbing is a fantasy, you take what you can get. Nothing says welcome to the world like being born beside someone else's digestion schedule. Even noble women weren't spared. Sure, they had more layers, because who doesn't want more fabric between themselves and the possibility of comfort, but they also had chambermaids. If you were lucky, a servant would assist in your disrobing, repositioning and redignifying. There were even special portable chairs with holes in the seat for noble women to do their business in style. Sounds elegant until you realise you're sitting on an open bucket while your maid holds back your embroidered robes and pretends not to hear the truth echoing beneath you. So the next time you see a medieval painting of a woman looking serene in 30 pounds of velvet, remember this. She might have needed to pee when the painting started, she might still need to pee. But she's holding it like a saint, a warrior, and an endurance athlete wrapped in wool. Medieval women didn't just survive history, they survived logistics, and they did it while pretending they didn't smell like desperation and moss. In a time when food preservation was a dice roll and hand-washing was witchcraft diarrhea, wasn't just unpleasant, it was biblical. One bad fish pie and suddenly your intestines were reenacting the Book of Revelations. People didn't just get the runs. They got the galloping, foaming at the mouth, prey to every saint you know intestinal collapse. And the worst part, there were no bathrooms. Just a frantic sprint to the nearest bush ditch, or, if you were really lucky, the family cesspit, which, by the way, was already full. Diarrhea in the Middle Ages was a group event. Entire households could fall like dominoes after sharing the same suspect stew. Imagine 7 people racing in different directions, robes, flapping socks, forgotten, all trying to beat each other to the designated poop trench, screaming, crying, praying, and still holding their tunics up with one hand and their shame with the other. If you want a realistic medieval simulator, skip the sword fighting and just eat spoiled cabbage in wool underwear with nowhere to go. The truly horrifying part, diarrhea could kill you. Fast. We're not talking mild inconvenience, we're talking medieval dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and died on the way to the dung heap. Diseases like dysentery and cholera spread like gossip in a monastery. One bucket of contaminated water, and the whole village was squatting and sobbing in unison. And with no IV fluids, no oral rehydration salts, and no idea what a germ was, recovery wasn't a guarantee. Some people wrote their wills on the 3rd trip to the latrine. Even royalty wasn't immune. Kings, queens, bishops all reduced to whimpering robe-hiking puddles of regret after a questionable feast. One chronicler recorded that Henry I of England died from a surfeit of Lamprey's translation. He pooped himself into the afterlife. Another nobleman reportedly perished after ingesting a bad pear, which is the most terrifying fruit-based obituary imaginable. Forget assassinations, forget duels. In the end, it was always digestive betrayal that did them in, and yet people kept eating the same garbage over and over. Mouldy bread, mystery meat, stale beer left in barrels previously used to store fish. Kazunga doesn't care about microbes or taste. You ate what you could when you could, and hoped it didn't leave your insides looking like a battlefield. If it did, well, good luck squatting behind a hedge with no pants, no dignity, and the sound of your own doom echoing through the valley. So the next time you have a mild stomach bug and reach for ginger tea while sitting on a heated toilet seat, pause. Reflect. You're living a luxury kings would have killed for. And if history teaches us anything, it's this: never trust medieval seafood, especially if it smiles back. When the Black Death arrived, it didn't knock, it kicked the door in, dragged everyone into the mud and asked who forgot to wash their hands for the last 3 centuries. Medieval folks didn't know about bacteria, but they definitely knew something was wrong. Bodies piled up towns, emptied, and suddenly everyone was pointing fingers, but not at rats. No rats were just misunderstood roommates. People blamed smells. That's right, according to medieval science, stench caused sickness. The worse something smelled, the more likely it was trying to kill you. This genius theory was called miasma, the belief that foul air caused disease. So when the plague hit, people responded by waving herbs around like confused florists and burning incense until the air smelled like death and disappointment. But here's the kicker, they never thought to clean up the actual filth causing the smell. Latrines overflowed. Chamber pots were still flying out windows like clay grenades. It was like trying to cure smoke inhalation by spraying perfume on the fire. Some cities got creative. They ordered streets to be cleaned, which usually meant pushing the waste slightly to the left. Others banned the dumping of poop into public waterways, which sounds nice, until you realise it was never enforced, and most people just found sneakier ways to chuck their shame into rivers. People believed that if they could just get rid of smelly things, the plague would vanish like a bad dream. So of course they started burning everything, rags, animals, and even people who smelled weird, just in case. And when that didn't work, they needed someone to blame. Foreigners, women, the poor, people who looked too healthy during an outbreak. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Lepers were hunted like diseased witches. If your neighbour saw you take a suspiciously fresh breath near the dung heap and not vomit, you were suddenly a public enemy. Hygiene wasn't just about staying alive, it became a reason to light torches and grab pitchforks. Meanwhile, the real killers, rats and fleas, kept doing their thing, blissfully immune to medieval logic. The irony is almost cruel. The same waste people refused to clean was fueling the very plague they feared. A simple sewer system might have saved millions, but instead society doubled down on superstition incense and moral panic. Because why deal with a cesspit when you can burn a baker who smells funny? So yes, plague poo and blame formed a very cosy triangle in medieval times. Everyone suffered, no one learned, and the streets kept flowing with both sorrow and sewage. The only thing more infectious than disease denial. Let's shatter an illusion. Kings, for all their gold-threaded robes and jewel-encrusted egos, had to poop just like everyone else. No divine bypass, no holy sphincter. When the royal stomach rumbled, usually after a feast of lamprey's swan and wine that had more floaters than flavour, His Majesty made the royal march to the nearest bucket or hole, or if he was especially spoiled, a wooden throne with a hole in it and a velvet cushion, fit for a king until you realise the cushion never got washed. The most hilariously tragic part, kings had staff for this. Meet the Groom of the Stool, a real job title, not a Renaissance insult. His duty was to assist the king during his movements, clean him up, and keep track of bowel habits in a journal. Yes, someone got paid to maintain a royal poop diary. His Majesty passed a noble and firm motion. This morning praise be, and somehow this position gave men incredible political power, because once you've wiped a king's butt, he either trusts you forever or fears your blackmail potential. Royal toilets or close stools were glorified chairs with buckets underneath. They were carried into the bedchamber like ceremonial objects, and some even had embroidered lids because nothing says dignity like hiding your poop bucket under a velvet flap with your family crest. In winter they added warmed cloths for comfort. In summer they added herbs to mask the smell. But no matter how many rose petals you tossed in, it still smelled like fear and digestion. And unlike commoners, kings didn't squat. They sat regally, upright, with back support, because even their bowels had posture. But let's not pretend this was a private affair. Servants, attendants, scribes, maybe even a jester nearby. It wasn't uncommon for monarchs to conduct business while conducting business. Foreign ambassadors have written records of kings negotiating treaties mid-defecation. One described the King of France relieving himself with great concentration while issuing orders to his generals, multitasking medieval style. It wasn't just weird, it was psychological warfare. If you can stare down an opponent while pooping, you're not just royalty, you're terrifying. And yes, queens had their own versions too, though a bit more discreet and involving far more layers to disrobe. Noble women had special toileting stools, and their maids knew more about their digestive schedules than their husbands. Court life was an illusion of grandeur stretched over a reality of bad plumbing and cabbage burps. Behind every banquet was a royal bowel disaster waiting to happen. Behind every throne was another throne, smaller, smellier, but just as politically charged. So next time you watch a medieval movie and see a king brooding in candlelight, remember he pooped in a bucket, surrounded by dudes, with someone taking notes. Absolute power doesn't mean escaping the call of nature, it just means answering it with more velvet and slightly more fanfare. When you imagine medieval law, you might picture public executions, trial by fire, or the occasional witch dunk. What you probably don't imagine is a legal fine for pooping in the wrong place, but oh, it existed. Because when everyone's dumping waste into alleys, rivers, and each other's flower beds, sooner or later someone has to say, okay, enough. Cities began drafting actual laws about human waste, making it one of the few bodily functions with criminal implications. Welcome to the bizarre, steaming world of medieval sanitation ordinances. Take London, for example. By the 14th century, the city had so much airborne feces it practically had its own weather system. Officials issued regulations forbidding the emptying of chamber pots onto the streets during daylight hours. The key word being daylight. Tossing poop out the window was still allowed at night as long as you yelled something like "Gardyloo" to warn passing peasants. No warning, that was a fine. Yes, there was a specific punishment for failing to shout before launching your bucket of digestive history at pedestrians. Some cities took it further. In Paris, dumping waste into the Seine without a permit could get you fined, flogged, or both. Repeat offenders were sometimes jailed. Imagine sitting in a dungeon because you couldn't be bothered to walk your bucket another 20 feet. Even worse, landlords could be sued if tenants caused a stink, literally. Property disputes in medieval courts sometimes involved detailed testimonies about fecal flow direction. That's right, people once swore under oath about which way the poop rolled. And if you think these laws were purely civic, think again. Church leaders got involved too because they believed that foul smells offended God. Some sermons explicitly linked bad hygiene with sin. The logic went like this: poop is gross, grossness is unclean, uncleanliness offends God. Therefore your bad bathroom habits might condemn your soul. It wasn't just a health issue, it was moral decay. Want to be holy? Start by not flinging your waste near the convent garden. Of course enforcement was inconsistent. Guards weren't lining the alleys with poop patrol whistles. Most laws were ignored unless someone rich got splashed or a particularly vengeful neighbour filed a complaint. You could get away with years of waste-based crimes until one wrong bucket dump turned into a civil case. And then suddenly you're in court defending the physics of a flying turd. My lord, the wind was strong, the pot slipped, and I shouted "Gardyloo" thrice. Medieval justice was nothing if not colourful. So yes, the medieval world had a legal system for managing waste, and it was weirdly thorough. There were bylaws, penalties, poop-based lawsuits, and sanitation inspectors who probably cried themselves to sleep. Because in a world without indoor plumbing, the law wasn't just about order, it was about odour. When you hear the term Privy Council, you probably imagine a room full of powdered wigs and parchment whispering about diplomacy and war taxes. But let's just pause on the word privy, because before it meant secret, it meant toilet. Yes, the most elite advisory board in the kingdom was named after the place where medieval people dropped their daily regrets. That's not metaphor. That's history's dirtiest inside joke, and nobody seems to be laughing quite enough about it. Originally, the Privy Chamber was the king's private quarters, and the Privy Council were the guys allowed into that sacred space, including, awkwardly, the toilet area. You see, monarchs conducted business everywhere, and I do mean everywhere. If the king needed to poop mid-conversation about foreign policy, the conversation didn't stop. The advisors just kept advising. Diplomacy was discussed over digestive sounds echoing off stone walls. Imagine trying to negotiate a treaty while your ruler is grunting on a wooden bucket. That's not strategy, that's survival. And these weren't just background nobles either. The Privy Council included some of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Archbishops, treasurers, earls, everybody trying to stay relevant and downwind. Being close to the king meant literally standing near his throne while he used a throne. Proximity meant power, and power meant tolerance for smells, awkward silences and the occasional splash. Historians love to phrase it gently, like the monarch conducted business while in repose. No, he was pooping, and the empire waited patiently. It gets better, some monarchs actually preferred to do business this way. Henry VIII was notorious for hosting council members in his privy chamber, sometimes even while his Groom of the Stool was on duty. That's right. While one man wiped others pitched tax reform. In a way, it was genius. Who's going to argue with a guy while he's mid-defecation? That's peak psychological dominance. Kings didn't just rule by blood, they ruled by intestinal momentum. And the irony? As time passed, the term Privy Council became more symbolic, detached from the stench sanitised for history books. But the name stuck. Because deep down, every monarchy is built on two things: power and plumbing. One changes the world, the other makes sure it doesn't stink while doing it. And once again, medieval life proves this eternal truth, no matter how noble the title. It probably started with someone holding in a fart during a budget meeting. You've probably had a bad bathroom experience, maybe a clogged toilet, maybe a surprise splash. But unless your toilet has detonated beneath you in a fireball of historical irony, you haven't truly suffered. In the medieval world, this was not a hypothetical. Toilets actually exploded. Not from poor plumbing or overeating, but from methane gas build-up in tightly packed cesspits. That's right, centuries of compacted human waste trapped under castles, and cities fermenting into a bomb waiting for one torch too many. Here's how it happened. Medieval waste pits were deep, dark, and sealed off ideal conditions for anaerobic bacteria to party like it was 1349. These bacteria released gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide, turning cesspits into giant underground fart balloons. Now toss in a chambermaid with a lantern or a servant with a candle looking for dropped jewellery, and boom! Your entire courtyard just turned into a flaming latrine. There are records of latrine workers being launched from pits. No one called it fireworks, but it sure lit up the night. In 12th century Erfurt, Germany, there was an infamous incident where a group of nobles gathered over a cesspit during a meeting, because of course that's where you host your most powerful guests. The floor collapsed. They fell in. The pit exploded. Multiple high-ranking individuals died covered in flames filth, and what I can only assume was instant regret. You can't write that off as an accident. That's divine toilet commentary. And this wasn't just a castle problem. Towns with shared latrines and poor ventilation were ticking time bombs. Cities tried to mitigate this with vent shafts or lime dumping, but most folks didn't understand why the pits exploded. They just thought it was demonic punishment or sorcery. He lit a torch in the outhouse and was swallowed by fire, a clear sign of sin. No, Martha, that's chemistry, and your husband just violated every principle of physics and self-preservation. Of course, medieval engineers learned slowly. Instead of redesigning toilets, they just added warning signs or banned open flames near the latrines. But people being people, accidents continued. Don't bring a candle into the poop pit sounds obvious today, but back then it was a lesson paid for in flaming trousers. Some towns even designated gas checkers who sniffed around the cesspits to determine danger levels. Imagine that job. Gregory, take this stick and go see if the privy smells explosive today. Medieval occupational safety was a punchline wrapped in a fire hazard. So yes, toilets exploded. Literally. And every time you flush your porcelain throne without a puff of flame, thank the modern gods of plumbing. You live in an age where bathroom visits don't require risk assessments and fire insurance. Our ancestors exploded so we could sit in peace, light a candle, but maybe not in the bathroom. We've walked through filth-soaked alleys, peered into royal poop thrones, squatted with peasants, and barely escaped fiery death by latrine. And now, dear reader, it's time to end this medieval bathroom odyssey with a reality check. You are unbelievably outrageously spoiled. You sit on a smooth porcelain bowl, push a shiny lever, and your waste disappears into the ether like a magician's assistant. No shovels, no chamber pots, no screams from below. Your bathroom is likely temperature controlled. It smells like eucalyptus or fake lavender instead of rotting goose guts and social collapse. You have toilet paper, not straw, not moss, and not a shared sponge on a stick. You have privacy, a door, a lock, and a room dedicated entirely to your bodily functions. That's luxury your medieval ancestors would have wept for, though let's be honest, they were probably dehydrated from dysentery and couldn't manage tears. Your city has underground pipes, sewage treatment, and someone whose actual job is to make sure your waste never meets your nose again. Compare that to Brother Thomas, who had to scrub the monastery reredoter with a stick and a psalm, or to Agnes the peasant squatting behind a cart while praying no one walked by with judgment in their eyes and hay in their teeth. You've never had to apologise to a neighbour because your chamber pot missed the window and hit their goat. You've never inhaled a fatal fart cloud. You live in a world where plumbing works, disease doesn't lurk beneath every outhouse, and no one's died in your toilet in at least a week. And if it does clog, a professional shows up with gloves, tools, and zero chanting of Latin. That's progress. That's civilization. That's flushable freedom. So the next time you hear someone complain about bathroom inconvenience, hand them this story. Or better yet, make them read part 6 and imagine falling into the guardrobe shaft at midnight during a hailstorm. Gratitude isn't abstract, it's porcelain pressurized and plumbed. And every toilet flush is a quiet hymn to the suffering of history. May it never explode beneath you.